Hi everyone, thank you for listening. Today we are talking about Daniel 6. So we are continuing our series on living in exile. And today we are reaching the end of the chronological part of the book of Daniel. Now Daniel chapter 1 to 6 is all about his chronological life. And then chapters 7 to 12 take place at different places in his life, mostly near the end of his life, and they're more about prophecy. So today we are on the kind of the end of the chronological life of Daniel. So now at this part in Daniel's life, he's probably in his 80s at this point, as he was taken as a teenager to live in Babylon. And now he's under the rule of the Medo-Persian Empire. So he's no longer under the control of the Babylonian Empire. He's under the control of the Medo-Persian Empire. So where we ended last time was in chapter 5 is the Medo-Persians took over from Belshazzar, and now King Darius is in control. And this is where we begin. So it's important to realize that King Darius, who's he's more of a regional king in Babylon. He's not the controller of the overall empire. That would be King Cyrus. So who we're introduced to in chapter 6 is Darius. So the Medo-Persians have taken over, and now things are changing in Babylon. And the greatest change we see, and we would view this as a positive thing in our society, is that the Medo-Persians were a people of law. So when King Nebuchadnezzar was in charge, he was the law, and he really did whatever he wanted to. He was a living law and could change laws as much as he wanted to. But with the Medo-Persians, even the leaders and kings were bound by the law. And once laws were in place, everyone had to follow them, even the kings. So Darius is still well known. Daniel, is still well known in this new empire. So he was chosen to be one of the 3 main administrators who oversaw 120 lesser administrators to oversee all the affairs of this new empire. And as we see, because God is working in Daniel, everyone sees how great Daniel's work is, and King Darius plans to put him in charge of the whole kingdom because of his good work. So we too have a role in the kingdom. So like Daniel, even though he had an earthly position as an administrator, he was an ambassador of the King of Heaven to make God known, and that is our role as well. And one thing we see through history, and I'm sure you might have seen it in your own lives as well, is that people will despise you and hate you for the work of being an ambassador of God. Remember that you are an ambassador of a different kingdom. And earthly kingdoms do not like that heavenly kingdom. So in the story of Daniel, all the other administrators, all 122 of them, so the 120 lesser administrators and the 2 other major administrators, despised Daniel and sought to undermine him because they were jealous of him. They knew he was the Jew from Babylon, and now he was going to become in control of them, so they couldn't handle that. And so one of the first times in history we see a law was put in place, a written law, that no one could worship any other god but Darius for an amount of time. So what do we do as Christians when the law is against us? Do we compromise? Do we avoid breaking the law, yet break the law of our God? So we're sometimes put in times where we have to compromise. Do we avoid breaking the worldly law, or do we break the law of our God? And this is something we see in Scripture happening all the time, that God's people are not only persecuted by the people around them, but by the laws of the nations they live in. So this is what makes leaders increasingly hostile towards Christianity at some points, is that Christianity requires all of your allegiance, that you follow God's law before human laws, and at times will break human law if it infringes on God's law. So in World War II Germany, many pastors were increasingly becoming persecuted by the government's laws. They were pushed to follow Hitler and not Jesus, to swear allegiance to Hitler and get rid of the biblical Jesus, and sadly, many did. Many did compromise their faith. And what's more surprising is the relevance of their excuses. So some compromised so that they could evangelize to the Nazis, since they were kept out of concentration camps. So they would argue that, well, if I'm put in a concentration camp, then I don't have a witness. So some compromised so they could look after their families. Some would say that I feel called to look after my family as my primary charge, and so I need to stay with them rather than be put in a concentration camp. And so they compromised. But one pastor, Bonhoeffer, stood quite alone. There was very few like him who stood up. And he was ridiculed by his peers for being extreme, for making a scene, and was eventually executed a couple weeks before the end of the war for standing up against the Nazis. So when we stand up against evil and are ambassadors of Christ, some of those even closest to us, some of our peers, will and can turn against us. So in this story, Daniel breaks the law. A law is put in place that would come up between him and his God, and he puts his life on the line, knowing it is better to die than it is to compromise. He stood quite alone. The majority was against him. So today we are looking at triumphing over opposition, standing alone against opposition, and how we can do so. And now there are three principles we're going to look at that we can get from this text on this, and that is integrity. So Daniel's accusers found no charge against him apart from his God. Then the second is prayer. Daniel had a great prayer life with God, and nothing interfered with it, and it gave him strength. And lastly, faith. Daniel did not compromise in the small things, which allowed him to not compromise in the bigger things. My hope is that you will know where your allegiance lies, that you will see the Christian life requires dying many times to your own desires, to the things of this world. That sometimes the Christian life requires putting your own life on the line, risking being put in jail for your faith, risking being ridiculed by your peers. If we compromise when nothing is at stake, when we compromise when it's just our popularity, how could we avoid compromising when everything is at stake? Now we're going to look at the first area, integrity. So in Daniel 1-5, Daniel chapter 6, 1-5, it reads, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, 'We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God.'" So the administrators, all 122 of them, despised Daniel, and they were looking for ways to sink him. So different scholars suspect that they would have had him followed, whether he was guilty of corruption. They probably would have sent women to try to seduce him, but Daniel had integrity. They found nothing against him. And we see this in our day all the time, where men and women of God in the spotlight are attacked and denounced, where they try to bring charges against them to ruin their character and integrity. And this doesn't just happen to Christians. It happens to many people in the public light. But what we see all the time is that when people are brought into the light, all their ugliness comes out. When someone is accused of something, it can be true. So as Christians, it matters that we have integrity, and it matters that we have character. And it's not just so that we can feel righteous, but that so others may see the gospel through us, that our very lives will be a witness to Christ, to God and to Christ. This is how the enemy tries to attack us. Now, living with godly integrity does not mean being perfect. It means being open and transparent. Daniel was not a perfect man, and I'm sure he made mistakes, even in his administration of the kingdom. But there was nothing in his life that was secret, nothing that could be discovered to use against him. In fact, I'm sure he was the first person to admit to the king about his mistakes, so they could find nothing against him to bring to the king. Now, what is the result of this godly conduct? The king respects him, the king trusts him. So when we live lives of integrity, we have credibility with other people. All of us have people in our lives who analyze us. They look at how we live. And even if they never admit it, they want to see if you will live differently, to see if you're living in a way they might emulate. So we live in an age of comparison where everyone is looking at everyone else. So if we don't look any different, if we as Christians look no different than anyone else, why would people listen to our testimony? Why would others listen to us when we tell them to live differently? Now, Satan will try to attack you in this area, to undermine you. If we live godly lives with integrity, with openness, we strip Satan of the ability to attack us in this area. So when these men were trying to attack Daniel to find things against him, they could find nothing to bring against him apart from his relationship with God. This inspires me that we would live such lives of honesty and integrity that if the CIA or the FBI analyzed your entire life trying to find things against you, that they would only be able to bring your relationship with God against you. As well, if these men were able to bring charges against Daniel, his witness would be shot. They would not view him as different than other men. When our integrity is attacked, our witness is as well. And if we are to stand up against the flow of this world, we need to have integrity and the confidence that integrity brings to walk against the grain. Now, the next area we're going to look at is prayer. Now, we read in verses 11 to 12 that, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So as well as integrity, which we just talked about, what allowed Daniel to stand alone against opposition was his relationship with God through prayer. We see that Daniel on a regular basis, so 3 times a day, would go to a quiet place in his house where the windows opened towards the city of Jerusalem, and he prayed. Now, prayer is something that is very easy to take for granted, but we can see here that this man was dependent on it. He needed it to do his work. He needed the help and the comfort God brought. So he was always in prayer. We can learn some things about his prayer life by looking a little deeper. Now, first, Daniel's prayer life was private, so he went to his room. Second, his prayer life was God-centered, so he faced Jerusalem, remembering the promises God had made about his people. Third, Daniel's praying was consistent, so every day, 3 times a day, as he had done before, he went and did this prayer. 4, Daniel's prayer was expressed in a spirit of humility, so he got down on his knees and prayed to God. 5, Daniel's prayer focused on thanksgiving, so he gave thanks to God despite the hardship he was in. And 6, and lastly, Daniel's prayer focused on personal requests. He asked God for help. So the most godly people I know are constantly in prayer. So why is this hard sometimes? Why is it hard to be in prayer? And why can we be so distracted? And I really think this is an area in which the enemy is attacking us in all the time. That the devil wants to cut you off from God through prayer. Daniel was afraid. And the men found Daniel asking God for help. So Daniel knew he was breaking the law with his prayer. But it didn't matter. Because no law man makes can stand in between us and God. And any law set up to prevent our relationship with God has to be broken. Daniel's relationship, his prayer life with God, was foundational to his day. He depended on God for strength. And he knew he could not stand up alone without God. Now, does this look like you? What is your prayer life like? Or do you find you can go through long periods of time where you just don't pray at all? Now, if your prayer life is cut off, if you are not in prayer with God, you will be open to attack. Because prayer is how we are sustained by God. Now, the next area we're going to look at for Daniel is compromise. So Daniel did not compromise in the small things, and that allowed him to not compromise in the big things. So in chapter 6, verses 13 to 17, it reads, "Then they said to the king, 'Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day.' And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, 'Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed.' So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you.' A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed." So as we see again and again, Daniel is putting his life at risk. He's thrown into the lion's den because he broke the law praying to God. Now, one thing we have to remember and what we have to look at closely is this law was put in place for 30 days only. So the administrators convinced King Darius to put a law in place that no one could pray or worship any god but Darius. And this was only in place for 30 days, probably during a special festival towards the king. But Daniel still did not compromise. And compromise is something we can do all the time. And like the examples I gave earlier about pastors in Nazi Germany who made excuses for their compromise, when times get tough, we justify our compromise the same way so we don't feel guilty. So we look better. Daniel could just not have prayed for 30 days. Many of us go without 30 days of prayer all the time. He didn't have to pray to the king. He just didn't have to pray to God. So he didn't have to pray to the king specifically. He just had to not pray to God for 30 days. As well, why couldn't he have just prayed in his head? There's many compromises we think of that Daniel could have done. He could have just prayed in his head for 30 days. If he was put in the lion's den, and remember, Daniel was in a high-ranking position. He would have lost an opportunity to witness about God. If Daniel's in a lion's den, he can't witness to anyone about God. He can't tell them about God's glory and what God's going to do. But Daniel still did not compromise. He would rather have died than disobey this law. Now, why is this? Is this just an extreme example of faith, or is there a principle here we need to learn from? In Matthew 10, Jesus is sending out his 12 disciples into the world, and he says to them that they are going to be like sheep among wolves, that they are going to be persecuted, flogged, and hated for bringing witness of Jesus. And in verse 34, Jesus says, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the member of his own household." So Jesus is talking about the inevitable persecution you will face for bearing witness of him. That persecution will come from even your own families. And we are told to expect this as we are sent out as his disciples, that we will be persecuted. The disciples were told to stop witnessing by the law. They didn't and were flogged, and they were told to stop sharing the gospel and were put in jail for disobeying it. We should expect persecution of Christians. The idea that God wants us to live a comfortable and peaceful life is not true. Daniel was able to stand up and willingly give his life up. The disciples were able to do the same thing because they had died many times before. Now, what I mean by this is they had died to their own desires. They died to the idea of wealth. They died to the idea of their own comfortability. So they died many times. They did not compromise on small things, so that when everything was at stake, when their lives were at stake, they easily gave up their own lives. When I was a kid, I always imagined that I would be a missionary somewhere, and I would have such faith that if someone had a gun to my head and asked me if I was a Christian, I'd say, yes, 100% I'm a Christian. Yet in my school and with my friend group, I would hide the fact that I was a Christian, or I would look no different than anyone else because I wanted to fit in. Now you see the irony in this. If I was compromising when very little was at stake, when it was just my own popularity that was at stake, how could I compromise when my life was at stake? Now, what is the compromise right now in your own life? And we all have it. I'm just as guilty of it as you. But it needs to be dealt with because we are living in a nation that is less and less Christian. And more we are going to be faced with situations where we can either face persecution or compromise. And friends, if we compromise when nothing is at stake, we will compromise when everything is at stake. So where do we end with this? Where do we leave? What do we leave here doing differently? And as we know from the story, Daniel is rescued from God who shuts the lion's mouth. He is rescued because he was faithful. Now, Daniel did not know God was going to rescue him. I doubt he was expecting it. He probably thought he was going to die and prepared himself for it. Now, many Christians have died in situations like Daniel, where they put everything on the line and died for it, and God didn't save them. Now, are you willing to put everything on the line? And remember, this was in the job description when you signed up for it. When you became a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, he told you about the persecution you would face, that you would be picking up your own cross and following him. And it seems overwhelming and it's hard, but it's worth it when you put things into its eternal perspective. It starts with integrity, walking in the confidence of that a godly life brings, being open and transparent about your life. It starts with a real prayer life with God where you share these struggles with Him, where you're on your knees asking Him for strength to continue. It starts with not compromising in the small things, with putting to death your own desires and comfortability and following Jesus in the small things. So that when the big things come, and they will, you will be able to pick up your cross and follow Him, whether you stand alone like Daniel or not. Remember this, you are able to put everything on the line because Jesus put everything on the line for you first. He gave up His life for you. He gave up his comfortability for you. He gave up His throne in heaven for you. And now He is calling you to pick up your cross and follow Him. Knowing that Jesus put everything on the line for you allows us to put everything on the line for Him. Thank you for listening.